Hey, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending where you're at and happen to be watching this. So I kind of teased out this phrase, uh, bilateral anterior cervical lymphadenopathy. And the reason why I did that is when I'm charting notes and I use that phrase, it always gets me wondering, like, what do patients possibly think when they read that? Like, if somebody sees that in their note, like, how can they possibly, like, what would they think that is? How could they possibly even have any idea of what that phrase means? Like, oh, it's like such a long phraseology. And the real basics of it, I'll get right to it because I teased it out. What is bilateral anterior cervical lymphadenopathy? Basically, swollen lymph nodes in your neck. I mean, that's really all it is. And I wanted to explain a little bit more about that phrase. And again, it's what kind of teed this whole thing off for me was when I say that I use that phrase for a very specific reason. Now, sometimes I change it up a bit. Like I might say they have no bilateral anterior cervical lymphadenopathy, or maybe they have right-sided or left-sided anterior cervical lymphadenopathy. But I use those phrases and those words very specifically and for a reason. And that reason is that's what I'm paid to do. No, not really. Well, kind of. That reasoning is when I say that, anybody who knows anything about medicine or the human body or anatomy will know precisely what am I talking about. For you as the patient, what am I saying? I'm saying your lymph nodes are swollen, right? But I'm saying very specifically that it's the front, the cervical lymph node in the front, right? Anterior is the front of the neck. And so because I get this thought in my head of what do people think about that phrase, it got me kind of further thinking about like the anatomical position. And it's something that for us in medicine or anybody in healthcare, you probably have a very strong sort of idea of this anatomical position. It's so strong and so ingrained that we really don't even have to think about it. It just is, right? But if you're not familiar with the anatomical position, then the question is, well, what the heck is it? Like, what do you mean by anatomical position? And it's actually a very important concept in medicine. There's this idea of when I'm describing something in the body, especially a place, like a point on the body, I'm using these phrases and words so I can tell somebody exactly where it's at. Well, that person that's hearing these words and these phrases also has to have in their mind the anatomical position because that makes us all talking about the same body, the same position of the body. And the best way I've come to think of it is kind of like a car, right? So if I tell you, hey, your driver's side blinker is out, you literally don't have to think about the anatomy of the car, right? The shape of the car. You know precisely when I say that, where is the blinker that's out? If I say, the rear right side is out, you know precisely. And in our head, what we think about when we describe a car is we're thinking about our position in the driver's seat. That's kind of like the standard, the anatomical position when describing a car is you're in the driver's seat. And everything around you is relative to you being in that seat. And that's the basics of anatomical position. It's where are you at? Where's the body position? So that I can describe where stuff is. And then that standard position, that position of the car, the body, and you can then know exactly what I'm talking about. I actually drew you guys a picture. I'm fairly famous for my artistry, which I'm going to show you this picture here, and you're going to realize I should have been an artist and not been involved in medicine. Here's the picture of the anatomical position. Okay, maybe not such a good artist. I take that part back. But the basics are the same. It's a stick figure, right? And that's really kind of the anatomical position. It's a figure in your head of a body with a person basically upright, and their legs are straight, their head is straight facing forwards, the arms are out to the side. And I say forwards, but that may mean something different than it does to me. I mean, forwards could be your arms just way out here, or forwards could be your arms like this. In this case, forwards is with the palms facing forwards. And the thing about the anatomical position is this standardized reference points, again, for everybody to be on the same page of where things are at. And when you're viewing or envisioning, I guess, in your head where things are at, you're thinking about this anatomical position, standing up, palms in front, facing forwards. Okay. And the other thing you think about when you're looking at positional body positions, where things are at on the body, like what's left and what's right, you always want to have this reference in your head of the other person standing in front of you and you're face to face, right? You're face to face. So, pardon me, if I say that thing on that person, they have this mass on their right arm, when you're looking at the person right in front of you, you don't go look to your right side, because that's not the right side. It's the wrong side. It's the right side for you, right? But it's the left side of the patient because they are facing you, right? That's the view you want to have. This patient in front of you, palms out. So that's extremely important when we're thinking about anatomy and where things are located in the body. And this is not I'm not throwing this video out there for an anatomy lesson. It's, if anything, it's more of a med term kind of brusher up on anatomical position. But the whole point of it was just conceptually, when I say anterior, I want you to understand what's the anterior. And if I say, bilateral, what does that mean? Well, that means both sides instead of unilateral, one side or the other, or left or right. And so that's why I wanted to kind of run through the anatomical position. So the next concept when you're dealing with the anatomical position, now that we all understand it's this position with somebody looking straight out, their palms out in front of you, um, is how can I describe where it is I want you to think about? Like, where is the thing that I'm focusing my attention to? The ailment or the bump or the mass or the tumor.
It's not a tumor.
Or whatever, right? So where do I go when I want to describe those things? So we use a lot of phrases. And if you're somebody who's beginning your journey into medicine, or if you're studying a medical terminology class, uh, or even if you're just an accountant and just care, right? These are the phrases that you want to kind of hear and pay attention to. So one of the first ones is anterior. And anterior, and that's again with my phrase of the bilateral anterior cervical lymphadenopathy. When I say anterior, what I'm really saying is it's to the front, to the front of the body, right? Versus the opposite of that would be posterior, meaning it's behind me, right? It's in the back. So you would use that phrase very, very often. And when I talk about the lymphadenopathy, right, big fancy word for swollen lymph nodes, it's very relevant because when we have these cervical lymph nodes, you have sort of like a couple chains and a couple like rows. One of those rows just happens to be on the front, and one of those rows just happens to be down the back. So that is what I mean when I say it's an anterior lymphadenopathy, right? And cervical just means kind of the neck. And so it's super, super important to understand that very, very basic phraseology of anterior, posterior. Actually, all these anatomical sort of planes, or not planes, I apologize. Planes are more like sagittal or frontal, transverse, a whole different thing. But these positions, these terms that indicate whether it's front or back, and then there's a few others. One would be superior. Superior doesn't mean it's the best. There's others that are probably the best, right? So doesn't mean it's the best. Basically, superior means it's above or on top of, right? You could use, in terms of anatomical position, you could actually use some other phrases as well. But so superior, above, you could potentially say cranial, which would be kind of this direction. The opposite of that is inferior. And again, that doesn't really mean that it's less. I guess you could kind of think about it as it's less high, it's less up, but ultimately inferior does not mean it's of lesser value. It just means it's below. You could potentially also say caudal, right? Kind of lower. So a couple other directional terms that are really, really vital are lateral and medial. And these are used a lot. And many of you probably had something that was described as a lateral or medial epicondylitis. Lateral epicondylitis or medial epicondylitis is tennis elbow or golfer's elbow, although you don't have to play tennis or golf to get either one of those. But that's describing lateral epicondylitis means kind of to the outside, right? And if you can envision a line down the center of the body, which is going to be pertinent to these next two sort of sets of phrases, medial and lateral, and then the next ones that I'll run into as well. So anything that's kind of on the outside edge is going to be a lateral area, and when it's on the inside edge, it's medial. And again, using the knee and the elbow because they have a very good way to describe this. A knee in particular, people have a thing inside their knee, right, called a meniscus. Very common to tear those, a very, very common injury. So there's a medial meniscus and a lateral meniscus. Lateral meniscus, lateral just means the outside of the knee. Medial just means on the inside of the knee. So when you have this injury, you have lateral meniscus tear, one on the outside, or medial on the inside. These terms are used very, very regularly. Um, they're easy descriptors, but actually uh, there's a lot of terminology where they are used as the defining characteristic of what you're talking about, inside or outside. And then the next one that again kind of uses the center of the body as the reference point is proximal and distal. So distal is distant, right? It's far away. And then proximal is close. I don't know why they'll call it closimal, but it's proximal. So proximal, like if you're thinking about an arm, if you look at an arm, so distally is going to be further away from the center, further away, or distal to a point. Like, this wrist is distal to the elbow, and then the elbow is proximal, meaning it's closer to the center of the body. So those are also really, really important terms. Those are something that I use very regularly in sort of in an urgent care setting because I'm describing oftentimes injuries. Where is something located? Is it proximal? Is it distal? Is it anterior? Is it posterior? Uh, Again, going back to anterior cervical lymphadenopathy, the sort of thing that kicked me off in this direction. Anterior just means the front. So it's the front side of the cervical region, right? And the neck. In this case, most people would understand when I say cervical lymphadenopathy that I'm talking about the cervical lymphatic system or lymphatic chain in particular. And when I say anterior, most people would know the front, but those are most people that are going to be people involved in medicine. And so, a couple other phrases that I'd touch on that are kind of like the body planes. I have to admit that I don't use these phrases very often, but they're certainly part of kind of the anatomical position. So they warrant just a little bit of explanation. So one of the first ones is the frontal plane. And essentially, it's as if you were taking a line and just dividing your body in half all the way up like this. And what it does is sort of way to divide out the front and the back, right? The anterior and posterior portions of a body. Again, this is a phrase that I don't use a whole lot myself. Most definitely, there are some. You would see this a lot, like on an MRI or a CT scan. These descriptors are very commonly used there. Probably some other places I don't even know about, but they're just not phrases I use a lot. My setting's more in an urgent care setting, so the 6 or 8 phrases I talked about previously to this are definitely the ones that I use more commonly than not. So then we have a sagittal plane, and sagittal plane is literally as if you took a line right down the half of the body and split yourself in two, and you have a right and a left half. This kind of idea of an imaginary sort of line down the center would be the sagittal plane. And then the last one is the transverse plane, and that's essentially dividing the body in half of the upper body and lower body. So, but again, those are phrases. Certainly, if you're studying medical terminology, or this is your first foray into medicine in general, those are definitely some phrases you would want to be aware of. It's just not something I use a lot personally in my practice. Okay, so we'll wrap it up. That's anatomical alignment in a nutshell, as far as I'm concerned. Uh, I intend on sort of covering some other topics. This one just for some reason was sticking in my head. I just want to get it out, lay it out there. The next kind of thing I want to do, which should be a little more fun, hopefully, is I'm going to talk about some words that are really fancy words. And there's a ton. I mean, there's just a lot of words like this that are very, very fancy words for simple things. And just a very brief, kind of simple example is a hordeolum. And I kind of threw this out on TikTok just as my very first video on TikTok, really saying that, if you hear this phrase hordeolum, you kind of think it's a fancy high price whore. Um, but it is not. Sorry to disappoint. Hordeolum is just a fancy word for a sty, sty in the eye, right? And so in medicine, we commonly have these words that are just big and fancy and cumbersome to describe very simple things. And, it's just sometimes it's by tradition, sometimes because that's the Latin word, sometimes it's um, because we like them, right? I mean, these words are cool words, actually. I very much enjoy the terminology of things, the way things are described. It's almost like poetry. It's hard to see that when you're not involved in it, but it really is interesting. I think of it the same way as like somebody who knows computers, and they use these kind of terms and phrases. They talk about computers almost in a lovingly way, right? But they're just speaking this language. And to me, I have no clue what they're talking about. It's almost like another language because it is another language. And so my hope is that by bringing a little bit of this to you guys, that'll open you up a little bit, and maybe, just maybe, you'll fall in love with it, and it might be something that triggers you to move forward and do other things in your life, either medicine related or anything, right? You might just say, wow, it's cool to understand what these words mean. And then maybe that gears you towards computers and you start studying computers because you just are interested in how words affect people, what words mean, and the fact that sometimes these words sound big and scary, but they're really not when you break them down, or if you can just kind of memorize the things like an hordeolum. So I'll leave you with one that I like a lot. Uh, I'm going to tease this one out. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You could Google it. I'm sure Google knows everything, right? Or right now, AI knows everything. Veruca vulgaris. That's a great one. I will cover that in the next video. Again, I appreciate your time. Please take the time, hit me a like if you can, hit the subscribe. You know all the business. Throw a comment, whatever the case may be. All that stuff's free. Just takes a few minutes of your time, and at the end of the day, it's what's going to help kind of grow this out a little bit. The YouTube algorithm loves those things, and I am very foreign to the YouTube algorithm, seeing as how I have no other videos. But I'll try to throw some more posts up pretty regularly. I don't know what that means. Maybe every couple of weeks or so. I'm really just trying to throw some vids out that I think are interesting and fun and stuff people like. Again, my concept here is to dissect out uh, medical topics and bring them kind of more into the realm of normalcy. So people who just aren't in medicine kind of can understand what's going on with medicine, or at least the topics that I find interesting. I'm going to be working on something actually pretty soon that I think will really be exciting, where I'm going to cover like circus freaks. Yeah, I'll let it sit like that, and hopefully I'll be able to bring that to you guys soon.